My name is Cecilia Munoz, and I am super, super excited to be part of this event today. Thank you so much for joining us. I am here with two of my colleagues who helped found the Public Interest Technology Project at New America, who do extraordinary work, each of them in their own right, and have had extraordinary careers. But most importantly, for this particular moment, they are co-authors of a book, Power to the Public, which is a book that focuses on public interest technology. It focuses on, and in this case, we're going to zero in on why data is really only as good as the people who are using the data. I've had the book is not out yet. It's coming out in April, but I've had the joy of both reviewing it and of watching these two authors at work, both writing the book, but also doing the incredibly important work that they do, both for our Public Interest Technology Project at New America, and also something we call the New Practice Lab, which Tara developed out of the public interest tech work that we do. So welcome. I am really, really excited about this conversation, and we hope that you are eager to take part in it. So I want to start by asking both of you really, it's a two-part question. One, why did you write this thing? And what is public interest technology anyway? Like what are we talking about, and why are we talking about it? So Hana, let me turn to you first, and then over to Tara.
Sure. So I'll take it first. Why did we write this book? It's funny because when we first started this program, we had a lot of conversations about like, will anyone ever be interested in this topic? And how do we get these kinds of stories out there? And who's going to ever want to hear about government and technology and data and research and all that? And little did we know that the world was suddenly going to have a PIT moment, public interest technology moment, in part because of how much we're relying on government in a crisis to deliver money and vaccines and things like that. So we are really in a moment here. We started the book before all of that happened, thinking we were, and then wrote it during the pandemic, obviously. And I think so we always sort of had in the back of our minds as part of this program that we would start developing books for the field. But I think what we needed an opening, and we needed also for the field to be mature enough to have really good stories to tell. So that was part of the impetus. And I don't know, Tara, do you want to define the field?
Yeah, I'll define the field as we talk about it in the book as really a practice that is somewhat expansive and builds on other fields. We focus in on three elements of the practice broadly, using data to understand, real-time data to understand what's happening and if something is working, testing ideas, policies, programs with the people for whom they're designed. So you can call that user-centered research. It's a practice we describe that goes back to anthropological trait of organizing, really understanding what motivates people and keeping a feedback loop between the people who you're serving and leaders of programs and government officials. And the third piece, which is the most broad, is really we found all the amazing leaders we interviewed were doing some semblance of this combination of three things. And the third was that they had really cultures of learning. They started small, they tried something out. If it didn't work, they course corrected before they scaled it up. In the kind of tech practices, this would be a minimum viable product, but really the broader ethos was to try, test, see if it works. And if it doesn't, to stop doing that and course correct. And so these are the three practices we really talk about in the book. For me, on the reason, I think Hana and I ended up at a book length is that it took a little while to explain, and we had done shorter versions of trying to make this work visible. And it's like layers of an onion. The more you unpack it, it isn't straightforward. We wanted to have a chance to really unpack it with all the layers, that no app will end homelessness. This is more than a single piece of data. This is a practice in how you solve public problems.
So a couple more foundational questions before we dig in. Maybe there's an obvious answer to this question, but why now? Like it feels to me like we're living in a moment where what's happening in the world is shouting at us that we kind of need this field to really come into being, and that we need practitioners to really be present in government and really make sure that we're delivering things for people. But like, am I right? Is this a good moment to be having a conversation about public interest? Hana?
Yeah. I don't know, Hana, do you want to? I'm happy to start or let you go.
I think this is a great and also critical moment because, so I will tell a very brief story, which is that before this book, we at New America, we put out a much smaller book called The Government Fix. And I have a very longtime friend who has worked on Capitol Hill for her entire career, who came to this event where we talked about this book, which had some much smaller stories that we had shared up until that point. And after the event, she said to me, "I finally understand what you do." So I think that it's like public interest technology is it's not a phrase that rolls off the tongue. It's not something that is actually easily defined. Anybody who works in it will, I think, can attest to that like it's very hard to tell people at a party what you do. But at this moment, all of a sudden, the entire country needs to interact with government. So I think part of why it's been hard to explain it is that most people don't interact with government on their day, or they don't think about their interactions with government on a daily basis. And all of a sudden, all of that is front and center. And we are seeing the results of, we at New America have been for a very long time saying something bad is going to happen and it's going to be really bad. And it's sad to say that like we are now at that moment that we were trying to raise awareness about. But on the plus side, all of a sudden now there's a lot of focus on like, oh, government not so good at delivering things to the way that we're used to having services delivered. So hopefully this crisis will not go to waste.
Tara, this is an obsession with you, isn't it?
Yes. It's been almost a decade since I worked on the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, which was in some ways one of the most high-profile failures before it was the most high-profile successes in the nexus of policymaking and delivery. But there are many groups, BetaNYC, Bloomberg, Code for America, who've been out kind of building the practice among the people who are in it here. And I think we really, for this moment, we felt like there's a stride for the folks who are in the work and know what they're doing, but the work will not expand without getting to Hana's friend on the Hill or the next layer out of chiefs of staff, a fresh turnover in state and federal government offices, that whether you care about kids or you care about climate or you care about homelessness, that the practice of how you bring your ideas into the world is changing at such a pace that, the crisis in particular does put this on display. I'd say Hana and I, in the middle of writing the book, woke up and saw, while things seem to be crashing and burning with unemployment sites in the United States and challenges having the government deliver basic information about whether you should or shouldn't wear a mask in the spring. I read this story in the New York Times about Germany, where in 10 days, dollars went out to gig workers and people described it as refreshing and seamless experience. And so it's a reminder that this isn't easy work, but that it isn't rocket science. It is possible, and around the world, some governments at moments really did deliver in a way that was different. And we had similar stimulus checks and stimulus efforts here in the United States, but the last mile of making sure those reach people is mission critical. And I think part of what we're aiming to do is say policy is really important, right? What you decide to prioritize really matters, but whether it makes the impact is really about whether it reaches people. Shots in their arms, stimulus checks before you lose your apartment. And so we looked around and we tell a story about places that even in this crisis were doing things different, and the government was really working.
So to dive into the details a little bit, you make the case, and I will say I read the book, and maybe that I start out biased because I'm like the president of both of your fan club, but you make a really compelling case that the practice that you're talking about, the way this needs to work, really depends on three things, and they conveniently start with the same letter: design, data and delivery. Like that's at the core. So I'd love to ask you to tell a story about each of those things, right? Help us understand, why does design matter? What helps us illustrate why data matters? What can illustrate why delivery matters? And let's start with design. And Tara, you tell a story in the book about Seville, about what happened in Michigan. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure, it's a really amazing story. Sevilla is the small design organization, nonprofit, that grew out of scrappy office in Tech Town, which is to say we're familiar with, part of Detroit. The work done by Sevilla really comes from a longtime United Way staffer named Michael Brennan, who spent 40 years of his career working on poverty programs. And in the course of this, he has a report commissioned showing the amount that the state of Michigan is spending on poverty programs. And there's a footnote in the report that mentions that Michigan has the longest application in the country for a series of public benefits. And Michael gets obsessed with the form and he prints it out, which takes nearly 70 pages. He tapes it end to end, becomes a huge scroll. He's the CEO at this point of United Way of Michigan. And he rolls it out as the physical symbol of, you need help, you need emergency food assistance, you need emergency cash. Check out this nearly mile-long form. And when you fill it out, that's actually only the first hurdle in us helping you. And he really saw for a moment that they were investing huge amounts of dollars, but that it didn't really look like help. And it's the charge that Michael and a new organization he forms to tackle this, with a few Stanford D School designers, to really investigate and learn from the frontline workers who adjudicate this form, and from the people who are receiving a series of benefits in Michigan, how the process could be made better. And in the course of their project, which they call Reform, they cut the country's longest application in half. They deeply listened to the public sector workers who had ideas about how to make this better. And they fundamentally transformed the access that people have to things like food assistance and Medicaid, and really built a model of what delivery could look like. And the design, you look at a form that's that long, it asks incredibly inhumane questions, like, how many fathers does your child have? It kind of been built over years by different pieces. It wasn't very effective at collecting data on the backside. It wasn't really made for humans, and they talked to people about what it felt like to fill out this form. They even gave the senior officials in the state of Michigan, after doing a bunch of user research and collecting data about how the form worked, they asked some senior leaders from the Michigan Health and Human Services Department to come to their offices for a briefing. And instead of having a memo or a slide presentation, they reenacted the experience of walking into a public benefits office. It was loud, it was noisy. They gave the officials clipboards. There weren't enough chairs for everyone, and they asked them to fill out this super long form. And it was very awkward at first. They sat in silence. Many of the officials hadn't actually seen the form that they were the overseers of. And then they walked them through the experience of their own frontline workers, in their words, from a bunch of user research. And it was this kind of out of the box process where the state of Michigan decided they were going to collaborate with this nonprofit on the spot to redesign this form. But at the essence, Cecilia, the design was not really made for humans, and we have a lot of processes that are made, without the final person in mind, maybe new rules and new questions and new processes conglomerate, but really returning for nonprofits and governments back to this essence of, who am I serving? Who is it that's filling out this form? How tired are they? How much time do they have? How many days off of work would they have to take to execute us helping them with food assistance if they're an hourly wage worker? That really, we try to animate the design work that brings people back to understanding, who is this designed for? And if it's aimed to help them, does it really feel like that? It's an amazing story.
It is an amazing story. All right, Hana, I'm gonna, just in keeping with the theme, I want to ask you to talk about a delivery example.
Sure. So because delivery is kind of a weird word, I will, especially for New Yorkers who have many things delivered, I just want to clarify that when we refer to delivery in the book, what we were talking about is really that last mile delivery of whether that's like a vaccine into an arm, money into a pocket. How do people actually get the thing that that government is offering them? So in the book, one of the examples that we one of the stories that we share, which has a great delivery piece, but also has a great piece around how simple sometimes the fixes are. So Marina Nietzsche was previously the CTO at the VA at the federal level. And at the end of the Obama administration, she was rolling off and looking for her next thing. And she had always been active in child welfare. She had been a foster parent. She'd been involved with foster kids, even as a college student. And it's something that she cared a lot about, so that she knew that was something that she wanted to work on. And she had the opportunity to work on the foster care system, the child welfare system in Rhode Island, which was one of the states with the longest backlog of applicants for foster parents. So she went in and her team mapped the process of, well, how do you become a foster parent? All these people are, so part of what the state was focused on was, how do we get more people to apply and more people into the system, because there weren't enough beds in homes for children. But once she started digging in, she realized, actually, this is not an issue about getting more people to apply. This is about there being a long waiting list of people who have already applied and have not been through the system, so and have not been approved. So anybody who is familiar with government processes, this is a thing that comes up time and again, right? Is the approval process for people. So she did a deep dive into all of the steps. This was the first time this had been done. She mapped out all of the steps of what people had to go through for the approval process. And she discovered a few things that were blockers, the most significant being that there were 2 pages to a medical consent form, which had to be filled out. And the first page, they were 2 loose leaf pages. And what happened time and time again was people would submit the first page and forget about the second page. And so their application would be held up purely because they had not either noticed that there was a second page or hadn't submitted the second page. And so somebody had to call and ask them for the information. And the people who did the outreach to call them were not, sometimes it was confusing. They would call and say, like, I'm just calling to verify the following information, and not fully identify who they were. And so the families were confused. So what they did to solve this was they stapled the 2 pages together. And I don't have the number off the top of my head, but that increased the number of people who were able to move past that step dramatically. And one of the reasons that we tell that story in the book is to illustrate that a lot of the time, it's just a question of having a holistic view of the process and going through step by step by step to say, and why is this here? And is that legally required? And is that actually information that anyone does anything with? And is it really needed? And is there another way to do it that could be faster? So Marina Nietzsche did all of that work and was actually able to clear the backlog in Rhode Island by having a weekend marathon where they sort of crammed all of the services into one room and just got people through, and they were able to work through the backlog. But the other reason that we share that story is that her focus was on delivery. So it wasn't just enough to say, oh, well, yeah, it takes a long time to go through the process. Oh, well, she looked step by step at why was everything necessary, and had a real focus on the delivery here being, how do we get more beds available? And the way to get more beds available is to have more parents who are certified by the state to be foster parents. And it turns out the holdup was a staple. So this is why we really emphasize not only looking at holistically at the process, but also looking at how does delivery actually work? And this is something that we also talk about in the book around the CARES Act, the first stimulus package, and how and that delivery was not a focus of the first stimulus package. And there are still people, I believe, Tara, you have more handle on this than I do, but I believe there are still people waiting for their checks.
10 million people are still waiting for their checks.
Say the number again.
10 million Americans, while over 95 million stimulus checks went out to the low-income Americans who don't make enough to file taxes, needed to take an extra step in order to get their check because there's no address on record for them to be mailed a check. And so arguably 10 million of the folks who need the stimulus check the most.
So this gets at a pet peeve of mine, which is that we think we won the victory when a policy gets passed, when a bill gets signed, as by the way, the American Rescue Act just got signed like in the last hour or so. And it is not, which is not to say that that's not a huge victory, and I'm very excited about it, but at the same time, we don't log the victory until the dollars reach the pockets of the folks in question. And as you know, the whole country is getting a lesson in, the vaccine strategy doesn't count as a successful strategy as in the success that we need it to have until it actually gets in people's arms. And that's about delivery. But this is also, we're holding this event in coordination with Data Week. And so I want to talk about data, but before we get into that, I have been asked to remind everybody that we are live tweeting this conversation and you are welcome to join. You can follow at New America PIT. PIT is how we refer to public interest tech. So feel free to join in the conversation on Twitter. But let's talk about data. That is also essential to making sure that policy actually reaches people. I'm not sure which of you I was supposed to ask to chime in with a data story, but go for it.
Tara, I think you doing the
I'm happy to. I think, data, it's like the water now. So maybe just to define how we talk about data in this book in particular, I think there's lots of important uses for opening data, for using data. But in particular, we really saw profound impact when data is good enough, real time, and allows you to test interventions. And so, one of our favorite examples is the team at Community Solutions, which is a network that works in communities across the country at tackling homelessness. They don't aspire to improve or reduce the number of people who are unhoused. They aim to get to zero. And a key ingredient in how they do this with communities is there's a ton of data in analyzing homelessness. The federal government actually requires communities to spend upwards of $100 million a year on a massive data system called HMIS. Each community has to purchase it from private vendors. And yet there's also a once a year count of how many unhoused are in the country. And neither of these two things, it turns out, are really useful to help you understand the data you need to end homelessness. And the data-based intervention from Built for Zero basically said, it's not good enough to know if the rate is 1%. We need to know how many unhoused folks are here today and how many are here tomorrow. And ostensibly they create an almost, with a bunch of data protections, a by name list so they can see whether they're making progress. And the interventions that you might need if you're Tara McGuinness might be different from the interventions to become housed if you're Hana Schank. And so it isn't a rate, it's a set of people for whom your needs are served. So the way that Built for Zero creates ostensibly, works with their communities to build a system to sort of establish data hygiene on understanding the total population of unhoused by community. And then they work the list until it's zero. And to get to zero, you have to get up and get to zero every day because someone new is evicted and you're back at one. And so kind of assessing on this way really allows you to understand whether you are making progress. And also they really twin their data with what is a human-centered design, finding out what that person needs. What is the obstacle for them? Is it it may not be enough to have a house if what you really need is a job. They found in one community where they reached technical zero was that it was access to transportation that was fundamental in getting, which might not be the first thing you think, but is something that you learn when you interview a bunch of unhoused individuals and families to see what their barriers are. So pairing kind of macro data about who's unhoused with important data about the needs, about the needs of the individuals. And so, this real-time data monitoring, many social problems that we address, whether it's how many people in the United States have COVID to what is the rate of suicide, our general data collection happens a year, 2 years after. And so while it's incredible data that's available, gets rolled up at the state level to the federal level, if you want to get ahead on a rash of teenage suicides, if you want to tackle in real time the opioid epidemic, you need to know what's happening now in your communities. And it's imperfect, and there's ways to make sure that the data really represents everyone. It's part of the reason you need to go out, as Built for Zero does, and talk to people, because data just on a list can lead you really far astray, as we find in other examples. And who gets left out or who's overrepresented in data, we talk about a great deal. The kind of structural assumptions on race and gender and class that are baked into data can really lead you quite far astray if you only look at numbers on a chart without actually asking people what they need. But twinning this kind of real-time assessment, how many people are unhoused, with an understanding of the communities and individuals that you need was really a transformational intervention for community solutions. And dozens of communities are getting to zero, and something that I think some people believe is impossible when it comes to a persistent challenge of homelessness.
Thank you. So that what you just said speaks to a question which showed up in the Q&A, and I want to invite our participants to feel free to ask questions. You can use the Q&A, you can use the chat function. We are keeping track of them, and I'm going to do my best to ask whatever you all want to ask. But so the question that came in relates to structural racism, and it sounded like it resonated, Tara, when you told the story about the 70-page benefits application in Michigan, whether or not that structural racism plays a role here. The example that you just gave with respect to addressing the needs of people who are unhoused also kind of reference that there are some racist assumptions that sometimes get made. Like how much of this is, how does structural racism play in here? And are there ways that the strategies that you guys are recommending address it?
One of the things that we talk about in the book, and Tara just alluded to, is that it's not enough to have, like a lot of places have data. It's not enough to just have data in order to really understand the why. So the data will tell you the what, but to get to the why requires actually going out into the community and talking to people. And one of the, so I will say that we have discovered that there is structural racism embedded in, I mean, I think the world has also discovered it along with us, but in some of our work, we digging into, for example, unemployment insurance, that there is structural racism baked into how decisions get made around who should get help and who shouldn't. And so one of the benefits of going in and actually engaging the community and talking to people and unpacking all of the pieces that make up the larger system and asking why at every single point is a way to, at the very least, start to extricate some of the structural racism that has been baked into so many of our systems.
Anything you want to add, Tara?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, who's curating the data, and are they members of the community, from which the data is being assessed. There's an incredible book that details exactly how communities of color and low-income Americans show up more in data sources. So if you were mining for certain things, then, wealthier communities may privately pay for public services, so that if you are trying to establish a sense of who's in and who's out and who's counted and who's monitored, that there are tremendous assumptions baked in based on race and class. I think the unemployment insurance really resonated for me. If you're working on unemployment insurance and you were unable to disaggregate the data by race, you would, we saw over the past summer that that Black and Latinx workers were overrepresented in the unemployment data and dramatically underrepresented in the Americans who were receiving unemployment insurance. but you wouldn't, you couldn't see that if you just looked at across at unemployment insurance. You'd really need, as a state system, to understand, wow, for every white applicant applying for unemployment insurance, we are getting fewer through who are actually receiving it. Some of that, as Hana said, goes way back to program design about which workers were cut in and out of the social policy from the beginning. But some of it comes down to default certain last names that automatically trigger, you have a hyphenated last name that automatically trigger a second look on the back end of a public data system. And so the importance of being able to see how a program, how a policy, how even a community organization is serving people, the data aspect of understanding whether it's working for the average person may tell you nothing at all about how it's working for Latinx men. And so it's both a tool that can be used to advance our understanding of the inequities, but I think could be used in a way that weaponizes, baseline assumptions. And I think we spend a lot of time teasing out that it is only as powerful as the measured nature and understanding of the folks who are using, reading, and analyzing the data, as well as who's in and who's out.
So that question, I should have said, came from Kenneth, and we have another data-related question from Ashley. How do you balance asking or adding questions to find out what people need without making the process even longer for the people who are trying to apply for assistance? Oh, look at the big smiles as that question comes up.
Well, I think we're just having some back and forth about a form today, so. So as the resident UX designer person, I'm always against adding. I'm always like, is this absolutely necessary? So there is, of course, always a tension between getting the information that you need and like getting any information at all. So you know that the more questions that you add, the fewer people are going to be able to complete whatever it is that you're filling out. But when we're talking about government asking questions, my experience has been that, and I think that this holds up also just from the examples in the book, it's worth questioning every single question that government asks. There are a lot of reasons. Government is old, and we talk about this in the book too. Government is old, our structures are old, our forms are old. The information that we needed to process something 50 years ago that's probably not the same information that's needed today. So of course, the ultimate goal for most processes, and this isn't workable for all government processes, but just speaking sort of globally about processes, is the ultimate goal is for them to be invisible. So the thing you need shows up because somebody knows you needed it and it's just there. So every question that you add in, so if you think about so that's a distance of 0 between what the person needed and what they received. And every question that you add increases that distance. So I think people need to think really carefully and also really dig into, why is this being asked? Is that a legal requirement? Where does it specify that it's a legal requirement? Who actually is doing something with this information? What are they doing? Are they doing something that maybe they shouldn't be doing, or maybe it opens the door for structural racism and for racist practices? So those are all good questions to ask. And I know we're going to move on, but I did want to just circle back to the last question for a second, and say that the fact that there is structural racism baked into so many of our systems is also why it is critical that teams be diverse, and that especially the people who are looking at the data and collecting the data and analyzing the data must include people from the community, and must include diverse viewpoints, because all data is not, you think you have a number and there are only so many ways of looking at that number. It turns out to not actually be true. And in the book, we tell a story from, it's actually a New York story about rat abatement. And this may be a story that people in this audience already know, but and should I wait, or is it okay to go into? Okay. This is one of our well, and I will say it's my mom's favorite story. So I just use that as a bellwether of like, that's a good story to tell. New York City was looking to do rat abatement. And in order to do that, they looked, this is the, I believe the MODA team, the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, looked at the 311 the calls from 311 to see where the rat complaints were, and they mapped that data onto a map of the city. And the somebody who was in the office in the MODA office, Amen Ra Mashariki, who I believe was one of the early data analysts, looked at that data, and he did the thing that a lot of people would do when looking at a map of the city. He looked at his neighborhood. And he saw to see like, well, how bad are the rats in my neighborhood? Like, I live there, I know what the rat problem is, but I'm curious to see, how is it represented by 311 data? And according to 311 data, where he lived in Bed-Stuy did not have a rat problem. And actually I should say, he'd grown up in public housing there. And so he looked specifically at the public housing. There was no rat problem in public housing. He still is in the neighborhood, or at the time he still lived in the neighborhood. So he also looked at the larger neighborhood and thought, this is weird. Like, I definitely have seen rats. So on my way to work. So why are there no rat calls showing up on the 311 data? And then he called a friend who still lived in the housing project, a friend of his from childhood, and said, so no more rats? all the rat problems all gone there? And his friend was like, what are you talking about? Of course there are rats. And he said, well, then how come you never call 311? And his friend said, what's 311? So I think what we learn from that is it's really important that somebody from the community is involved in parsing the data, particularly when you are looking at something that is community-based and location-based. And we know now that 311 data is biased to certain communities, but that was sort of an early instance of why it's so critical to have a diverse data team.
So I love that story too. And we have more questions that are along this theme about the connection between racism, between structural racism and the data. So this is an anonymously sent question, which is, how do you put policies in place to root out the kind of inherent racism that you see in data?
We, I think we'll offer some learnings from from the folks we interviewed and spoke to. I also think this is a live experiment, and there won't be one single clear-cut path we're going to need to try, test, and improve. I think a few simple basics. One, check the sources, just as you saw with 311. If our entire understanding of a problem comes from a single data set, we should really scrutinize the making of the data set. Two, the analysis, even who's questioning this, being representative of communities engaged. And three, I think we would strongly caution against anyone going exclusively down the road of data alone, or design alone, or of a learning culture. You need to use these three things together. So the data is only as useful, but you should take the big data and then go talk to 10 people and see if it shakes, 10 representative people, see if it shakes out. And so that practice of both using data, but really testing the assumptions with folks who are represented by a single digit in a spreadsheet is the third kind of piece of advice. And if you're doing all three of those things, you have a higher degree of discovery of what might be baked in and unseen and unrepresented.
So we have another anonymous question also in the same vein. So at one point in the conversation, we've said that there are ways in which data can be inherently racist. We know government systems can be racist. So how do you make changes without changing the actual systems? Like, is it possible to make changes if the overall structure hasn't changed? Is it possible to make progress and reach the people that we want to reach?
I think that we talked about that Pitt is having a moment, and I maybe this is hopelessly naive, but I do think that we are in a moment where everything is up for grabs in terms of systems and processes. And I think that is partially related to just where we are as a society in terms of how we expect things to function. That has changed dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years, just in terms of like everything's online now. That didn't happen before. And not only is everything online, but when things are online, you expect stuff to happen very quickly, and you expect a certain amount of rigor. I think so. I think that we are in a spot where, you know, there was sort of this revolution in the late 90s, early 2000s, where things were starting to be digital, and we're now at another place. And I also just want to add on the data piece, I'll echo what Tara said, which is that we're kind of in a brave new world when it comes to data. There is suddenly publicly available data that didn't exist before, massive amounts, scary amounts in some ways. And there are for sure going to be missteps. And one of the things that we are looking at New America is how to elevate the ethical use of data and create some kind of ethical pause or ethical impact statement or whatever it is, but to how to insert ethics into the practice of public interest technology. And I don't think that like that hasn't been figured out. We're still figuring out the practice. So there are for sure going to be missteps. I think that it's fair to be concerned that something might go very badly. And I think that we also know, in part because this conversation about structural racism and racist policies has been elevated and people are having it openly. So I think there is some hope that at least by keeping that conversation alive, it opens the door for people to say, oh, actually, this process that we've had in place for 100 years needs to be rethought.
Thank you. So I want to dig in a little bit to this. We've talked about design, data, and delivery. I want to dig into kind of public interest tech as a field a little bit, because part of what this book really is about is kind of making the case for why it should be a field, why it needs to be strengthened, and how that might happen. But I'd love for you to disentangle for me, because there's a variety of different terms. Public interest tech is kind of a relatively new term, but there are other terms which get at similar themes. So can you, and maybe Tara, I'll ask this of you, civic tech, gov tech, public interest tech, like, are they all the same thing? How do they differ? Like, what do they stand for?
I think we make the case they're not all the same thing, but you may think of them in kind of a growing family tree of some of them birth. I think civic tech birthed a bunch of this work. Some people associate more strongly with one of these affinity groups. And aim of our book is to kind of say, actually, there's a group of people, some of whom associate not at all with any of these terms, but are just the person in the basement of the police department who sits on the data in said city, who's just trying to use it to problem solve, who feel no affiliation with any annual conference, but that there is kind of an army of public problem solvers, some who have emerged out of a real focus on making data open and accessible, some who were their government partners who saw, wow, we've now been, first, we didn't want to make this data set public, but now that we've cleaned it up, it's very useful for us for our own management piece. A bunch of companies that have grown up to help governments that are struggling with this. So I think we isolate civic tech, gov tech into different kind of streams in a larger river, but we really think for the change that we need to be in service of citizens around the world. We're hoping people can see each other, can share practices, and think of themselves under a broader tent, and that if we are really successful, the term public interest technology will be irrelevant, that this will just be how we do solving public problems. Hana, I don't know if I've tackled that, but please pile on.
Yeah, well, I think that the first step to having a thing is naming it. And drawing a circle around it. And so the effort to name it public interest technology, we also at New America, and I don't think we go into it a little bit in the book, but not really. We have a whole other piece of our work, which is our university network, and trying to stoke the pipeline and also create an academic field that is called public interest technology. So there is that piece, which is like, maybe it's an actual academic field. And to that end, maybe that, growing out of it. It's not unusual, right, that you would have economics as an academic field, and then it permeates and that's probably a terrible example because I don't know the history of economics. But the point being that, this is a case where we're looking to have some interplay between how people get trained to be public servants and public interest technology. And I think that, just to echo Tara's point, that there is a hope that maybe it doesn't even, like, the name isn't a thing that will stick around because it's not needed, because this is just how you solve public problems.
Amen to that. So let me first of all remind folks that we're having this conversation on Twitter as well, so you can join us and follow at New America Pitt. Also invite people to continue to ask questions either through the chat or through the Q&A. And thank you to Kate, who has just asked whether we do a podcast because she could listen to you all day, which makes me so happy. But getting to this, so you talked about, Hana, about the Public Interest University Network, which New America and our colleague Andreen Soley coordinates, helps run. And our CEO, Anne-Marie Slaughter, likes to draw an analogy, acknowledging that it's not a perfect analogy, but that it's been useful in kind of framing the concept that of kind of matching public interest tech to public interest law, in the sense that there used to be a time where you went to law school, you worked for a corporation, you worked in the government, you worked at a law firm, and then because of investments from civil society, we kind of created, and investments by government, we created a field of public interest law. And now it's a thing you can study and like grow up and do. And then you can, work at the NAACP and be a public interest lawyer and, use the law to help make policy, help drive policy, to help make the country a better place. I think that I like, it's not a perfect analogy, but I like that analogy because I think one of the things that we're trying to do is kind of create the market in government for people to use this skill set, the technology skill set, to solve public problems in the way that you're describing. And one of the challenges is that we've worried about the notion that government can never compete with industry for the talents of the technologists that we're talking about. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, do we have a shot at bringing this kind of talent into government when everybody can just go work for Google and make 5 times as much?
So it's kind of fascinating to me, actually, that people, we've been doing a lot of interviews with the vaccine rollout. And one question that I get all the time is like, who would turn down free lunch and stock options and the cachet of saying they work for some startup or Google or wherever it is, to say that, they work at they work in policy at Health and Human Services or whatever it is. Like, that doesn't sound like a not to rain on everybody who's with me, who has worked on policy in HHS. But
Hana.
What's that? Sorry.
Hana and I, as co-authors, I play the role of like policy nerd. It's harder than you think. Some people actually sign up for it. Cecilia and Hana, this is our blend.
Yes. So I get this question a lot, like, who would turn down the money? How can the public sector ever compete with the private sector when we're talking about technology? And that was the question. So I was at the United States Digital Service in fairly early on, and that was also the question when they launched USDS. It's like, who would ever do this work? Who's ever going to leave their cozy stock options? And I think that that first of all, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the public sector and how great it is. As somebody who I spent the majority, 20 years in the private sector, the offices are better, and okay, yes, there are free meals, but like, I think if for people who want to do work that they feel like makes a difference and has a really big impact, like, those people are always going to be drawn to government. The issue is finding places for them. Right now, there's a real problem with there not being enough technical roles and enough places for tech fluent people to come into government. We're actually seeing right now, USDS has been completely swamped with applications. They have far more people than they can process efficiently. So many people are raising their hands right now to say, please let me help the country. I think in part because the government technical failures are so obvious right now. But government has a long history of being a place where the smart, ambitious people went to work. That was before our present moment, when government is kind of seen as like, why would you go there when you could go to Google? But people for a very long time have answered that question with, they're internally motivated. It's more valuable to them to spend their time in government. So I don't think, like, yes, the difference between salaries is bananas right now, and maybe the gap is bigger than it's been in the past, but there are still people who are really invested in their communities and who want to do good work for them.
Let me maybe ask a larger pit question, but actually I'm noticing in the comment, Alan just pointed out that the ruined housing markets in coastal metros make it hard for someone to choose work based on meaning rather than money, which is, I think, a very good point, right? Because you need to be able to afford stable housing, especially if you're early in your career. I would just also say that, so there's the federal government, and as Hana said, that there are opportunities and people are flocking to them because they're interested in making a difference. But city and state governments are also a place where we need PIT, right? It's the states right now which are implementing vaccines, and in some cases it's the counties. And it's states which are implementing unemployment insurance, and the states failed really, really badly in getting those resources to the people who need them. And some of the most exciting innovations are happening in cities around the country, and not even necessarily the largest metro areas, but even in small cities. So I think the truth of the matter is that we need public interest tech everywhere in government. And that's not only on the coast, but it's everywhere in the country, right? Because some of the most important interactions that people have with their government happen locally. So that's just another focus of activity that I wouldn't take off the table. But let me ask a general pit question, and I realize that we're rounding the corner on the hour. We want to keep the conversation going, but I'll also kind of keep an eye on it, and we'll continue it a little bit. But we recognize that everybody's committed time to this, and we're grateful for you. So Pitt, as Hana said, is having a moment. When we started the public interest tech program at New America now more than 4 years ago, we wondered how we might ever get a story about policy design or government tech into national publication. And like all of a sudden, it's kind of everywhere. So Tara, do you want to talk about like the moment that Pitt seems to be having and why that might be?
In some ways, the crisis has really pushed us to a moment where people, Hana and I take a strong stance in the book that there is no solving the world's hardest problems without governments, period. Full stop. That there's critical roles for nonprofits and private sector players, but that we still need city, state, county government. And I think if there were ever a time when you looked around and picked up a newspaper and saw that it is your local county health officials who are keeping track at the first cut of data of who has COVID, that it's a time when millions of Americans lost their jobs, and we do have a social insurance program through unemployment insurance, that in some ways in high and happy times, although frankly for many of us, the crisis was brewing before the pandemic when it comes to income inequality and structural racism. But in high and happy times, I think it's easier not to see the purpose of government. And we are not in a moment, I think, anywhere in the world where you don't see the purpose and role of government. And I think part of that has helped me the focus on how do these emergency benefits, the help in the flood and weather that we saw, and power outages around that in Texas, that the course of need for these things which we as citizens can't do alone is on display, and therefore making the work of delivery visible. The package that signed into law today, the American Rescue Plan, will have, if implemented well, will cut child poverty in have, by making sure that everyone who could get a child tax credit can access it, by making sure that funds move quickly to the states, which are trying to make schools easier to access and bring internet to places where schools are still not a safe place for our kids. So I think that you can't look at a single facet of life and not see that there's a role for government, and particularly in that last mile of how you reach people in meaningful times in crisis. And that has really helped accelerate attention on a bunch of these projects.
So does that make you hopeful? I mean, on the one hand, Pitt is having a moment and there's a lot of conversation about it. On the other hand, a lot of the conversation is about like, oh, government failing again and can never get it right. I mean, you both strike me as, look, you've both been public servants, you've both worked in government. You are kind of believers in what government can do and evangelists a little bit for people to do this work in government. But you've also seen this moment of crisis where there's more meaningful news about government not getting it right than getting it right. Like, are you optimistic about this moment and about what lies ahead? And maybe we'll make that the closing question. So let me turn to you, Hana, first.
I am optimistic. I read an article in the Times, I think it was this morning, about the bill that just passed and how this is really a return to big government, in which certainly growing up in the 80s and the 90s, big government, like, they're bad, very bad. But this is sort of a return to these big signature programs like Social Security that were, these programs that are developed to meet a specific population's need. And I think that the fact that a bill like that could pass, the one that today's bill could pass, and 70% of the country supports it. I think that we are at a place where more and more people are seeing the role, and especially coming off of the last 4 years where we didn't have an interventionist government. We are seeing that there's a real appetite, I think, for people need help. People need help, and that they're not equipped, that they can't give themselves. They can't devise their own, you can't like mix up a vaccine in your basement. You're not going to be able to, the child tax credit was the big news, I think, in this piece that I was reading. Those are, lifting children out of poverty isn't something that, like, sometimes people need help. And certainly we are, yes, big believers, but I think that the confluence of people, possibly more people than ever, really, really needing government right now, combined with the fact that we are in this moment where we have all of this tech capability, and we also really understand the value, at least in Pitt, and this is, I think, why this is a very important moment for this book. We understand that to really solve people's problems, you need to really understand them deeply. And that it's not just like, oh, well, here's the money, let's throw it at the door and see what happens. Not to, again, I'm not the policy person in this conversation, so not to diminish past policy practices, but that there is a real need and a real understanding, and also these new tools. So I think that we are in a very exciting moment. And yes, there is a lot of failure. There's going to be a lot more failure. People still don't know how to, the private sector fails constantly when they build tech tools. It just doesn't make the news because who cares? Because it's, people aren't gonna starve because the private sector couldn't get their burrito delivery app functioning. Not to knock the private sector. I'll just stop talking.
Thank you, Hana.
Like Hana, I'm incredibly optimistic. That doesn't mean that we're not clear-eyed. I mean, we talk a lot about how this is long work. It doesn't happen in a single gesture. It's the work of crisis and culture change, and takes place over time. But we wrote the book because we deeply believe that there are millions of people out there who are working in all different types of jobs, with an approach like this that could actually solve problems. And we know that that's possible because we found a few who really are making profound impact on things that were inconceivable. And so we hope that we wrote it to get out of the number of people that we capture and in an elevator or in our family meals or in extended visits, to say, like, it's working and you can make it work and you can be a part of this in some way. And if you are a designer, you can be a part of this. If you are a policy expert, you can be a part of this. You may be working in the back end of a processing effort as a public servant, but you can be a part of the change that makes things possible. And so it was incredibly inspiring when the world was falling apart this past year to interview people who were putting it back together and really showing results. And I think Hana and I took a lot of refuge for that in that. And if you look, I myself would not have said 3 months ago that 18% of the United States would be vaccinated and 40% folks would have an herd immunity. That there are signs that when we pull this together, we try new things and we admit when it's hard and try again, that we can fix things. And I hope folks, we know we're speaking to an audience of fixers and designers and doers on the data front. We really just hope everyone will spread the word that it is possible and it is everybody's work.
Thank you. So there's one question that I'm just going to answer really quickly from Anonymous. Is asking whether this field is a pathway from urban informatics programs. And the answer to that is yes, an emphatic yes. Right, that speaks to the whole question of data as one of the keys to this new kind of practice. And there are places you can read more about this, most importantly, by getting a copy of Power to the Public, and a link to the book is in the chat. New America also does a publication called The Commons at wearecommons.us, which is a place where you can find stories about public interest technology and in all of its various dimensions. It has a loyal and wonderful following. You can see also in the chat a way to subscribe to Pitt Universe, which is the newsletter of the Public Interest Technology University Network. There are lots of resources here, and it feels tremendously important as we try to build this field for us to stay connected to each other. So we really, really appreciate everybody joining us for this. Congratulations, Hana and Tara, on the book. I'm excited to see it go out into the world, but especially excited and hopeful about what this work represents for all of us. So thank you all very much. We're going to close it off here. Thank you, Hana and Tara. Congratulations, and we will see you all again soon. Thank you so much.